Good morning, everyone. Two cliches abound in the world of discussions around data. We often hear that data is the new oil. We also hear that data is the new currency. Now, we've heard of this many times, but common to both of them is an understanding that data is fundamental to human lives and the economy. So, it's quite obvious that data must empower individuals and businesses. But how do we do that? And what data governance mechanisms best provide these outcomes? My name is Arvind Gupta. I'm the founder of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. Over the next 45 minutes, I have the privilege of moderating a terrific panel to discuss this fundamental question: how can data governance mechanisms ensure empowerment of individuals and businesses? In the panel, I have Arvind Gupta, who's the co-founder of the Digital India Foundation, Neha Chaudhari, partner Ikigai Law, Jessica Robinson from the Department of Treasury, Government of Australia, and Rolf Schwartz, the senior advisor of the Foresight Outreach and Policy Reform Unit at the OECD. Thanks very much for joining this panel and welcome to everyone. The way we'll do this panel is we'll do a few brief opening remarks from everyone, unpacking the themes of this session, and then I'm going to ask some country-specific questions. And I request everyone to keep their remarks short, to about 2 to 3 minutes throughout, because we have 45 minutes. And to the audience, please feel free to ask your questions. The helpful folks at ORF will send your questions to us, so that we hope that we have some time to take a few of them at the end. So with that, let's begin. And let's begin with Rolf. Rolf, the OECD has been at the forefront of data protection norms with its privacy principles from 1980, which have recently been revised in 2013. How do you see this evolution of data governance norms over the last 3 decades?
Thank you very much for to ORF for this invitation, and thanks for that question. Very privileged to be here, and as you say, data is at the forefront of our work at the OECD. We collect data, we make it publicly available, and we analyze it, and we believe ultimately that all public policies need to be based on evidence and data, and that's why making publicly available data is so important, and the principles you mentioned are equally important in terms of the protection of the privacy of that data. I work in the field of sustainable development, and data protection has also become very important in that field because of we've seen that digital technologies are transforming the world, and we see there is an opportunity here, but there are also some related risks, particular opportunities when it comes to back better after COVID pandemic. We'll focus next year in our flagship report on development cooperation on shaping a just digital transformation. And there we want to look at the risks related to ownership, data protection, human rights and democracy, while also looking at the opportunities this digitalization has offered, particularly to developing countries, also to step up progress towards the SDGs. There are three related areas. One is the area of civil society and digitalization. We know that civil society organizations are at the front lines to combat poverty, inequality, and to advance a more just societies. But we also know that they need to be enabled, the civic space, particularly in an age of digitalization, to maximize their contributions to sustainable development. And we have developed a framework for that with civil society to help allow them prosper in that civic space. There's a second related aspect, which is related to women economic empowerment. There also, we've seen that technology can play a positive and a critical role in advancing this gender equality, but at the same time, and I think that's important to mention it also, in this context, there's still a growing digital gender divide when it comes also in terms of where women and girls in which fields they study, whether it's in the fields of science, technology, and engineering and mathematics, and we can also critically say with regard to our own members that not enough development aid is going to that. Only a fraction of that, of what is publicly the official development assistance is going to that field. So there is room to strengthen that. And third, you mentioned the importance of data governance and making data available. We are working with an international task force since 2015 on making, for the SDGs, developing a new statistical measurement framework, which is called Total Official Support for Sustainable Development. It's usually known under the acronym TOSSD. And it's a way of trying to track the global efforts to provide better access to innovation, but also to the global public goods related to sustainable development, and data is at the source of this. We have encouraged many countries around the world to join that effort. Many of them have done, and we are the opportunity of having to speak now in India is also a chance for me to say that we would really encourage India to participate in that endeavor as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rolf. Looks like there's a lot going on in the OECD as always, and I hope to unpack some of that as we go through this panel. Arvind, I'll turn to you. The session, if you've noted, is provocatively titled From Data Governance to Data Empowerment, which suggests that earlier the focus was on governance and not empowerment, and there seems to be some shift that's happening. How do you see this issue of data governance and data empowerment? Do you see governance and empowerment as binaries?
Arghya, the question is to me, right?
So the question is to Arvind.
To me.
Thank you. I think you took the words out of my mouth, Arghya, with saying that are they binaries? I must start, Rolf and Jessica and Neha and all of you to tell you that India has had a very different, I think, strategy and vision on when it comes to data. First of all, we don't treat this as a binary. We don't treat this as that you have to either govern and not empower. Whereas we have tried to find a balance between innovation, privacy, and the need for data sharing with the right purpose. So I'll just come and explain in a very. I know we have 2 to 3 minutes in opening remarks. I'll limit to that. So number one, it's not a binary. We believe that you know individual owns the data, especially the personal data, and with that, what kind of empowerment, as you rightly said, whether it's the currency or the oil, but without getting into the semantics of it, what kind of empowerment he or she can do to himself or herself so that the data really works for them. That's the core approach of the fundamental architecture, and the name of the architecture, as your panel has also suggested, is data empowerment and protection architecture. So it's it's not a binary, number one. And that is a very, very important thing that we have in India. Two, we have the second thing is, we have a PDP, we have open data, and we have had an open data policy for a very, very long time. Any data that is collected, the Personal Data Protection Bill is pending in Parliament, which will be the Omnibus Act for all of us to follow, for different verticals to follow, for different sectors to follow. But that's something that has been debated over 3 years, and has if it was not for COVID, we would have probably seen that bill be passed in the Parliament. It's gone multiple iterations, but that's one side. The second side is we started debating the non-personal data. And that is an ongoing discussion, and it will also evolve on how it can be processed, where it can be stored, and what can be done with that. But the third important point also is the whole issue of empowerment and open data. Especially, I think my colleagues from overseas should know this. India has had a very strong open data policy, and this is also ties up with a lot of other things like Startup India movement and making data as something that what we believe we in India, the government is a data billionaire already. So can we share anonymized non-PII data that can empower startups, that can empower government, that can do help in better delivery of services? So that data is already there. So the rule of open data is, if any data that has been collected by public funds is available out there for use for anybody, it's common license usage. So I think where I want to leave my opening remarks is that India is at a cusp of bringing the governance part, because there is an empowerment part where the individual really owns the data and shares the data comes in with the kind of architecture and the technology that we are bringing together. So it's our policy and our regulations are also tech enabled, and that's another thing that we are seeing at population scale. India is doing technology architectures which can be then implemented at population scale. So this is the approach that we have to the world of data and the data economy. And I leave you. Thank you there, and open for more comments later on.
Thanks, Arvind. I think that's putting it very well. That we've always been about empowerment in India, and I think governance is now playing catch up to see how it can play its part. So I'll take that to Jessica, perhaps for a different perspective, and your thoughts, particularly being in the government of Australia, on the evolution of data governance from where it was and to where it is currently, and how do you see it evolving?
Yeah, thank you. And that's a very nice segue from Arvind. And I have to say, I think I absolutely support your approach that it isn't binary, and that's definitely the approach we're taking in Australia as well. So, yes, I'm Jessica. I'm from the Australian government in our Treasury Department, and we're responsible for leading the work on our consumer data portability framework, which we call the Consumer Data Right. And the approach we've taken in Australia is to set up a legal property right, really, where consumers have a broad-based right enshrined in legislation to access data held by Australian businesses about them. So based on their transaction activity or any activity really as we start to roll out through the economy. And the way the architecture is set up is that the data that's brought into it is enlivened by a ministerial assessment and designation of particular sectors and data sets. So we are in the process of rolling that data right out across the economy. As I said, it's an economy-wide right. And at the moment, we're in the banking sector. We've almost completed the work in that sector with now consumers having the benefit of access to their banking data, and we're just about to commence the process for sharing data in the energy sector and then the telecommunications sector next. Beyond that, we're looking at a range of sectors like insurance, non-bank lending, etc. And the approach we've taken is to really, as I said, set up the governance architecture. What that does is provide the safe and secure rails for customers, consumers to access that data, and for that data to be shared with fintechs, regtechs, the innovation layer. So the approach we're taking in Australia is not that the government sets up the technology, but that it enables a flourishing, dynamic innovation sector to deliver new product and service offerings for consumers based on access to the data. And I guess enshrined in all of that is this concept of empowerment, and it's very much driven by consumer consent and builds upon our privacy protection legislation, and in fact increases upon that. So what we are doing is really through this framework as well is an uplift across the economy for businesses that are in the business of dealing with data, which almost all businesses are these days, to lift their info security profile and the personal privacy protections that they're offering to customers. So a huge transformational economic reform. The baseline of it was really to drive competition, but as this conversation's already demonstrated, once you're starting to deal with data and the empowerment of customers, really there's no limits we see in terms of how consumers will start to benefit from access to those data sets across the economy.
Great. Thanks very much, Jessica. I think that's a powerful rights and consent-based model for empowerment that Australia seems to have adopted. And of course, it will lead to more competition, but ultimately more competition, it is hoped, will lead to greater consumer interest. So we'll come back to that if time permits in the second half of this session. I'll turn to Neha now. Neha, how do you see data empowerment conceptually? It's something that's talked about in India quite a bit. The Indian Data Protection Bill there was a lot of commentary and criticism at the time that it was being introduced, that perhaps it doesn't look at empowerment as much. But as Arvind said, it's been 3 years and it's been in Parliament for a while. I heard that yesterday that the Standing Committee has finished its work and they will be presenting its report in the winter session. So how do you see this evolution in India in the last 3 years, particularly with the PDP bill kind of being in limbo?
Thanks so much for that, Arghya, and thank you to RF for having us here. I echo what Arvind and Jessica was saying. I don't think that this is really a binary conversation. I don't think it's a movement really from data governance to data empowerment. For me, data governance in India, and I think just on a philosophical level, has always encompassed data empowerment. And I think the first step towards that, or really the first pillar, I think then relates to the question that you were asking, which is data protection. I don't think it's possible to think about data empowerment without first having the ground rules in place for personal data protection. And a robust personal data protection framework which is hopefully what we're hoping to see when the personal data protection bill in India makes its way into Parliament, which is that it's grounded in consent plus plus plus. I don't think it's possible to again think about data empowerment or individual empowerment if you're grounding all of this just in consent, or equating really consent with individual control of data, which then leads to data empowerment. So when it comes to India for a Personal Data Protection Act, like Arvind was saying, I don't think that we've been having these conversations as binaries. I think it's always been part of the debate that we've been having in country, whether it's the personal data protection law, whether it's conversations around non-personal data, so on and so forth. What I wish would have happened is that we'd seen the principle-based legislation in Parliament before we'd seen sector-specific regulators take the lead. For example, with the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, or whether even in the healthcare ecosystem for right now. So I think you can't have data empowerment without having personal data protection. And for data empowerment, you need, I think, a robust accountability-based framework going well beyond just consent.
Thanks very much, Neha. I think this sets it up nicely because we are all agreed that they are not binaries, governance and empowerment, and you need good governance for empowerment. But I think it's time to dive into some of the more detailed issues that arise when we are trying to think about what models of governance best ensure data empowerment. So Arvind, let me come to you to take off from what you and Neha was saying, that while the PDP bill has been pending in Parliament, it would have been ideal if it were passed, but there have been a lot of sector-specific developments. You yourself referred to DEPA, the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture in the fintech sector, the National Health Data Management Policy, which is frankly massive in the health sector, or even the motor vehicles aggregator guidelines for transport aggregators in the transport sector. So lots of sectors are moving in very quickly, perhaps trying to fill in the gaps that the data protection bill has left. So how do you see governance evolving between fundamental horizontal legislations like the data protection legislations and sector specific guidelines or regulations?
Now that's most of the guidelines, and again I'm talking to an international audience, so let me explain what really this means. Is that mostly in the absence of an omnibus act, which is the PDP bill, which is pending, and hopefully we'll see the light in the Parliament. Sectors came up with their own micro policies, as you have just mentioned, especially RBI with its payments rules, data rules, and the account aggregator DEPA is a more open architecture. It's not, it's mostly for the fintechs. Then of course the health data has the part of the National Health Digital Health Mission has its own data policy within that, and then the motor vehicles aggregators. That's got a big impact on what the aggregators can do, but really a little bit about the data protection is also there in that. So in the absence of this omnibus thing, every sector has come out, but where we see it going is that the omnibus will be the PDP bill, the PDP vision and strategy will be the master thing, and then every sector will have to come out with this, and something I think Jessica mentioned on that front. Every sector will have to come out with its own. Whether it's e-commerce, whether it's health, whether it's finance or it's insurance, or every sector will have to come out with its own set of rules which are derived from the master bill and the master act. And I think in the absence of the same, a lot of people have come out with, a lot of verticals have come out with their own uh, rules and regulations, but I think they'll all get subsumed and consumed into the master bill once it's done, because that's the omnibus act that India will have. Are these required? Of course they will be, and that's, I think, a better principle-based approach. You guys are better lawyers than I am, so you can probably comment on the same, because having sector-specific agility in a master omnibus act is probably not feasible for the long term. So that agility goes away. So giving the agility, defining the broad principles in the main act, and then giving the agility to each vertical is the approach that I think India will end up taking.
Okay, great. I think that segues nicely into what I was going to ask Jessica, because Australia does have the Privacy Act 1988, which lays down kind of a broad legislative framework, which I'm given to understand, and please do correct me, has is been the foundation on which your consumer data rights program that you spoke about, which eventually seeks to be an economy-wide initiative to protect data rights of individual customers, is being rolled out on a sector-by-sector basis. So can you share a little bit of your experience of this what seems to be a dual setup with a broad framework legislation and now sector-by-sector consumer data rights? But also talk about the fact that when these consumer data rights are rolled out sector by sector and covers the whole economy, do we need a Privacy Act 1988 anymore, or is it kind of getting replaced sector by sector?
Yeah, thank you. So you're absolutely right. So as I mentioned before, our consumer data right really embeds a lot of our privacy protections into the data portability framework. And I think the difference between, for example, Australia's privacy regime and potentially the UK's or Europe's is it's not a broad-based one. We have a fairly big carve-out for businesses that don't earn that are below a certain income threshold. So it does mean that there are a lot of businesses that aren't captured at the moment. And what the consumer data right does is plug that gap, because it's dealing with it's dealing, as I said before, with the business of sharing data. So ultimately, as people may be aware, we are reviewing our privacy legislation at the moment, and we're expecting a discussion paper to be released shortly that will set a little bit of the direction of where government's thinking we might go on reviewing our privacy, or reforming our privacy legislation. But really, I think in the discussions we've had quite recently with other countries, the approach that we're taking in the consumer data right, which really does privacy plus, so it goes beyond just the personal information protection to also capture commercial information, confidential information from businesses. And that's because for Australia, our consumer is both business and individuals, so it provides a broad consumer access regime for both businesses as well as citizens. So I think that's an important distinction. So when we're talking about the privacy protections or the personal information protections, it's important for us to think about the fact it also extends to business data that wouldn't otherwise be captured sometimes as personal information. So I think that's a key thing to call out. The importance of having strong privacy and security protocols for consumer data right is absolutely baked into the framework. So it goes to the points that Arvind was just making, that we have taken the approach of applying or developing core principles that ultimately mean that when we
No, I think that's a great learning, because especially as India goes down this sector by sector route and several countries are looking at it, I think the fact that it's kind of the similar concerns in most sectors is actually a great learning. So let me turn this discussion a little bit, and other panelists can also come in, but I'll first go to Neha and then to Rolf. Because when we talk about data governance globally at this point of time, the elephant in the room is really questions around data sovereignty, right? This is an issue that divides us, and I think it would be useful, especially since we seem to be having a lot of consensus on this panel, to have something that perhaps where people could have different views. And there have been focus on recent past, particularly in China and in India. The OECD has always, of course, stressed on facilitating greater transport of data flows, and this is something that big business and small business everywhere needs. So first to Neha and then to Rolf, how do you look at greater demands for localization in today's data age? Does it further this goal of data empowerment, or does it take away from it?
Thanks, Arghya. Look, I mean, I've always had reservations of data localization. I've always been a proponent of cross-border data flows for pretty much the reason that you articulated earlier. I think we've done a fair bit of work, I would say, with organizations large and small, all kinds of tech companies, all kinds of investors, industry associations, across sectors. And I think this is, like you said, this has been something that big businesses and small businesses have all agreed on, that cross-border data flows are essential. And if you look at, if you go back to the framing that Jessica was talking about earlier, which I thought was very interesting, if you think about data empowerment also from a business perspective, especially a small business perspective, I think in that context also, particularly cross-border data flows are important. I understand where different states are coming from when we're thinking about data localization from questions of law enforcement access in particular, and I don't think that there is an easy fix or an easy solution. I definitely don't have one, but I would definitely land on the side of cross-border data flows are critical. They're good for the individual, they're good for the industry generally, and if data empowerment, whether it's data protection or whether it's data empowerment, all of it subsumed within data governance, I think cross-border data flows are an important piece of this puzzle. So yeah.
Thanks, Neha. Rolf, your views, how the OECD looks at data localization?
Yeah, very happy to come in on this question also of the question of global approaches. And I think we've spoken a lot about data governance, and perhaps we all agree that this is not binary, as we said at the beginning. But so I would like to stress also this other element, the empowerment dimension. So what helps enable policies to create that enabler framework? And that's very clearly we need internationally comparable data, and that's for me also the global aspect there. I mean, the OECD, we are not a global organization, but we do interact globally. So we have 38 members, but we interact with a lot of countries across the globe exactly for that purpose, to make international comparable data available. So for example, we interact with China, with India, with South Africa, with Middle Eastern countries, etc. And we seek that peer review so that there is this exchange, a little bit like Jessica was mentioned. What's the Australian experience? How can other countries benefit from that? And that has to be based on peer reviews or on peer learning. But one thing which we observed in that approach to make globally or internationally comparable data available is that we still have to convince a lot of countries to do so. So, I mean, I've heard the participants, I've heard Arvind and Neha, how advanced India is. So, in the field I work on sustainable development, a question maybe back to my fellow panelists: what can we do to encourage India to be sharing more of that experience, that data which it has? For example, I mean, we know when we speak globally again that many African countries simply do not have any personal data protection legislation in place. They don't have substantive laws on cybercrime. I mentioned earlier a digital divide when it comes to the role of women in many countries across the globe. And at the same time, we know India is leading. India has initiatives on science and technology initiative when it comes to Africa. We know that Indian tech companies are leading worldwide. How can we encourage India to be more part of that global effort of making globally comparable data available? And I mentioned at the beginning this effort which we have on the Sustainable Development Goals, this TOSSD. I mean, is there a way we can bring in all this rich experience and, for example, spotlight it there, and through that angle move much more on that empowerment angle?
So thanks very much, and I think that segues nicely into what I was going to ask Arvind, which is how can India play a greater global role in trying to ensure that some of these learnings and best practices that we've had in data empowerment is shared worldwide? Arvind, can you hear me? No, I think you're on mute.
There's a lag between the pressing the button and sorry. So quickly to answer and Arghya, your point and what Rolf said, I think India has joined the Digital Public Goods Alliance. India is doing a lot of work with GovStack. India is as a country or its different volunteer organizations within India are trying to take learnings from India. And Prime Minister announced the internationalization of CoWIN. We've already internationalized UPI. So India would be very happy to share its learnings with other countries. I think I've always said this, that the next 6 billion and the top 1 billion are being taken care of by the private platforms. The next 6 billion of this planet really look forward to India to lead and show the digital neutrality and really empowerment that digital can do from a bottom-up perspective. So part of that thing is India is very happy to share its experiences, whether it's on the identity, payments, the vaccination platform, and data empowerment.
Great. I think we have about 5 to 6 minutes left. So if there are any audience questions, I'd urge anyone who's listening in to type out their questions and some of the organizers to send that our way. I can't see any questions currently, but that may just be my interface. So please do send any questions that might be coming. But before we get any, I'll turn that to Jessica, because you said something that was rather interesting, which was about the fact that when we think about empowerment, it's not only empowerment of individuals that we should be thinking about, but also empowerment of businesses and enterprises, particularly small business. And one objection that we often get to regulation, particularly data related regulation in India, is that it's going to hurt small business quite a bit and they don't have the capacity to cope. So how has that experience been in rolling out the consumer data right I'm not fully familiar with it. So whether it includes all small businesses or whether there are any exemptions and certain thresholds that apply, and how small businesses have taken to your consumer data rights initiative.
Thank you. Yes, so I guess it depends on which angle you're looking at the participant from. So there's the data holder, who's the obligated entity that is often, I'll be honest, is often complaining about the cost of compliance. What we're starting to see in Australia, though, is many of the companies that are obligated to share data through the designation process are now actually applying for accreditation to be part of that innovation layer, to have access to customer data through that consent process to enrich the services and products that they're able to offer. So it's a really interesting transformation that we're seeing here that is really going to have an extremely disruptive approach to the incumbent, to the data that's sitting in incumbent businesses, and see that flow through the economy, including into smaller and medium business enterprises. So one of the recent reforms we just put through a few weeks ago will see a huge increase, I think, in the participation of small and medium businesses through lowering the barriers to accreditation, and in particular accounting platforms like Intuit and Xero being able to support more secure and safe ways of sharing banking data through their enormous ecosystem of software providers. So again, it's that incremental approach we're taking to lifting information security practices, but not expecting everyone to be in the same spot. So if you're obligated to share data, there are certain requirements you need to meet, and there are compliance aspects to that. As we're seeing the scale of it happening, though, that's getting dispersed a bit more, and we are seeing a number of businesses now developing that we're calling CDR in a box solutions. So the tech companies that are developing regulatory solutions for the data holders that are obligated under our framework to really reduce down those costs.
Already on mute.
Thanks very much, Neha, for pointing that out. I guess it's customary to do that at least once in every webinar. But I was saying that takes us to the non-personal data regime that India has been working on for the last couple of years, where the regime also tries to set up this new category of business called data businesses. So how do you see small businesses being able to leverage and get empowered by the vast availability of data, and how it can improve their business process functioning?
Is that directed to me again, or someone else?
To Neha. It was directed to Neha. I'm sorry.
Got it. Thanks for that, Arghya. Look, I think it's still very, very early days when we talk about non-personal data governance in the country. I think the idea, again, is something that everybody has agreed on. The fact that if you open up data, if you don't have data sitting in silos, and you're able to have movement of data amongst different businesses, businesses can use this data that's been opened up to be able to innovate, to be able to offer different kinds of products and services, which will be eventually good for the individual. The point that Arvind was also making earlier in the context of opening up government data as it exists within our open data framework and policies. But that said, I do think that there is a little bit more thinking that we need to do from a first principles point of view as well. Since we were speaking about small businesses, a large number of conversations that we've had with many of our clients, with several startups in India, there has actually been a lot of reservation, a lot of anxiety with really how this non-personal data framework is going to play out, because for these companies, the small ones, the big ones, data essence is your asset, right? It's what is it's really what's giving you competitive advantage. It's really what's giving you a moat against your competitors. It's intellectual property, and these are some of the questions that we really need to unpack when we're having conversations around using non-personal data for economic empowerment. So again, I address some of these other.
Okay, I think we lost that last bit, but I think we got a general sense, and I was told that we are almost out of time. So, Rolf, the last word to you, since you've spoken about the initiatives that the OECD has been taking in order to make sure that we have a global digital data commons, if I can use that word. So, where do you see small businesses as part of this commons, and how can you make sure that small businesses are empowered with the kinds of moves that you're trying to take?
Well, I think small business are exactly at the forefront of this. We know that since they're small, they are reliable on the data which is available, but they are at the same time also vulnerable to some of the elements we discussed in terms of whether it's too heavy bureaucracy, whether it's the protection of the data. But we know that small business, in particular startups, they have this role of to play also what we are calling, or what is sometimes called also in the UN, this building back better, of being at the forefront of creating also more sustainable economy and societies. And I think that's where they need the support from governments, from local entities, but also globally, that they have also this platform where they can express what is working and what is not working. That's what I mentioned, what we are trying to do at the OECD on our scale. What we can do is also bring them into the debates, not just having government to government debates, but also bringing the local business, but also the CSOs. And finally, I mean, thanks to Arvind, if I understand correctly, the way of going also about dealing with India is that particular this also bottom-up approach, and not just taking a top-down approach, but also working with all the potentials which are there, whether it's at the local level, whether it's at the tech level, or whether it's at the small and medium enterprise level, and moving it also up bottom up. So I took this away. Many thanks for that. That was very valuable.
Thank you. And I think that's a nice and optimistic note with which to end this session. We are out of time. But I think we have a fair degree of consensus that governance and empowerment are not binaries. And the way forward is by ensuring that we are building back better and that we are all in this together. We've had some fantastic lessons from Australia and the OECD, and lessons from India for the rest of the world. So I'm sure we can reflect on this as we go forward through the wonderful sessions that the Observer Research Foundation has organized and the platform that it has provided for these interactions. So thank you very much to all my panelists and to the ORF for again organizing a wonderful virtual edition of CyFy, and look forward to seeing everyone next year. Bye-bye.